Hello, and welcome to Architecture Topics. I'm your host, Liam Caron, and today we travel to Paris, to the late 19th century, to talk about the one and only Eiffel Tower. A tower which was about to change the skyline of the city forever. Although that wasn't exactly the plan back then, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But before, just a quick reminder that you can follow Architecture Topics on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or wherever you are listening. It takes just a moment, and it really helps the show. And you know what helps the show even more? A 5-star review. But for that, let's wait until the end of the episode to see if you actually like it. Deal? Great. So without further delay, let's go back to Paris in the 1880s. In the late 19th century, Paris was a city of contradictions. The wide boulevards of Haussmann had already carved through the medieval streets, giving the capital its grand geometric order, while writers and painters gathered in crowded bars and cafes to debate the future of art and culture. Gas lamps glowed at night, and on the banks of the Seine, the smoke of factories hinted at the new industrial age. It was still the city of Victor Hugo and the Impressionists, but it was also the city of locomotives and iron bridges. So when Paris was selected to host the 1889 World's Fair, France knew it wanted to capture that tension and turn it into a spectacle. The fair was also perfectly timed to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, a unique, patriotic marketing opportunity for the French. So the organization wanted a centerpiece that would astonish visitors, something bold enough to declare that French industry and engineering were leading the modern age. And so came the idea of a tower, but not from Gustave Eiffel himself, at least not at first. It came from two of his senior engineers, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier. In 1884, as the city began preparing for the fair, the two men sketched out a radical concept, a 300-meter pylon of iron lattice with 4 legs anchored to massive foundations, narrowing as it rose into the sky. It was bold, logical, and structurally sound. But when they showed the sketch to Eiffel, his reaction was cautious. He didn't reject it, but he wasn't convinced either. To him, the design looked too stark, too much like a piece of machinery enlarged to impossible scale. What it needed was presence, a touch of monumentality. So Koechlin and Nouguier sought help from within the firm. They turned to Steven Sauvestre, head of architectural design, and asked him to refine the look. Sauvestre added massive arches at the base, a stone pedestals, and even a glass pavilion at the summit. The result was striking. Still an engineering feat, but now with the grace of a monument. That was the turning point. With Sauvestre's refinements, Eiffel recognized the tower's potential. So in September 1884, the three men, Eiffel, Koechlin, and Nouguier, filed a joint patent for the design. Later that year, Eiffel bought out the rights from his collaborators, securing full control of the project, and started really lobbying for the tower to become a reality. Koechlin and Nouguier didn't disappear, though. Far from it. They remained deeply involved in the calculations, refinements, and eventual construction. Koechlin in particular would oversee much of the engineering detail that made the tower stand. But still, from that moment, it was Eiffel's name alone that would be attached to the audacious iron giant. Eiffel's lobbying efforts soon paid off. In 1886, the French government announced a competition for the centerpiece of the 1889 exposition, and the brief sounded almost tailor-made for Eiffel's design, an iron tower, at least 300 meters tall, to rise from the Champ de Mars. Hundreds of proposals poured in, ranging from elaborate monuments to fanciful machines, but none could match the clarity, feasibility, and detail of Eiffel's. His team had already run the calculations. Sauvestre had given the design a monumental elegance. And the patent? placed them one step ahead of everyone else. So while on paper the project was won through competition, in reality, the rules of the game had already been tilted in Eiffel's favor. By January 1887, the contract was signed. The total cost of the tower was estimated at 6.5 million francs. It is hard to calculate the equivalent in today's money, but that amount would easily translate to 40 million US dollars today, with some estimates going even higher. Eiffel agreed to cover more than 4/5 of it out of his own pocket, an enormous sum at the time. In return, he secured the right to operate the tower for 20 years, keeping the revenue from visitors. After that, the city of Paris reserved the right to dismantle it. Yes, the Eiffel Tower, the monument we now see as eternal, was originally meant to be temporary. It was a bold gamble, but one that Eiffel was willing to take, probably in an effort to restore his reputation after his involvement in the failed Panama Canal project just a few years earlier, where financial mismanagement tarnished his name. But not everyone was impressed. In fact, long before the first iron beams were set in place, the project provoked outrage. In February 1887, as construction began on the Champ de Mars, a protest appeared in the newspaper Le Temps. It was signed by 300 of Paris's most prominent artists, architects, and intellectuals, the so-called Committee of 300. They denounced the tower as useless, monstrous, and a disgrace to the City of Light. Will Paris, they wrote, be condemned to be associated with the grotesque mercantile imaginings of a builder of machines, like some gigantic black smokestack, crushing under its barbaric bulk Notre Dame, the Louvre, or the Arc de Triomphe. The language was fierce, and it reflected a genuine anxiety. For many Parisians, iron still belonged to bridges and train stations, not to monuments. A tower of exposed metal seemed crude, even dangerous, compared to the stone and ornament that defined the city's beauty. But Eiffel defended his project with equal conviction. He argued that the tower was not just an engineering machine, but a work of art, shaped by the laws of nature themselves. The curve of its legs, he said, followed the mathematics of wind resistance. It was strength made graceful, science made visible. Despite the protests, work continued in early 1887, with massive foundations sunk deep into the Champ de Mars. Each leg of the tower required its own set of piers, some anchored in compressed air chambers to keep out the groundwater of the Seine. Above them, 18,000 prefabricated iron pieces would be assembled with over 2.5 million rivets. Eiffel was obsessive about precision. Each component was drawn to 1/10 of a millimeter. Each hole drilled in the workshop so that the pieces fit together on site like a giant Meccano set. He also went out of his way to reassure the public about safety. The tower was deliberately over-engineered, with far more bolts and bracing than strictly necessary. His original calculations proved that it could withstand the strongest winds in Paris, but he added extra strength anyway, as if building confidence into the very skeleton of the structure. Construction was dangerous work, carried out by about 300 laborers balanced on iron beams high above the city, and Eiffel insisted on strict safety measures, such as guardrails, movable scaffolding, and even cranes mounted on the tower itself, all of which kept accidents remarkably low for the time. By March 1889, just over 2 years later, the tower was finished. On opening day, Eiffel himself climbed the 1,710 steps to the top and planted a French flag. This was now the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Reactions were mixed. Some still called it an eyesore, a temporary scar on the skyline. But the 1889 World's Fair proved the tower's triumph. Nearly 2 million visitors ascended its platforms, their ticket purchases generating enough revenue to recoup much of Eiffel's massive investment. This public embrace, despite the critics' scorn, showed that the Iron Giant had captured the imagination, if not of Parisians, at least of the rest of the world. But Eiffel saw beyond the fair's crowds. He saw the tower not just as a spectacle, but as a laboratory. He invited scientists to mount barometers, pendulums, even wind gauges on its platforms, and soon, its greatest experiment of all, radio transmission. By 1903, antennas sprouted from the summit, sending signals hundreds of kilometers across France. This new use changed the tower's fate. Because remember that, by contract, the tower was supposed to be dismantled in 1909. The land belonged to the city, and Eiffel had only secured the rights to operate the tower for 20 years. But in 1909, those very antennas would prove decisive. By then, the tower was no longer just a fairground spectacle. It had become France's most powerful radio mast. And the army quickly realized dismantling it would cripple a tool that had already shown its value in long-distance communication. So the tower was spared for now. Not by beauty, not by public opinion, but by science. And soon, the Iron Giant would return the favor. In 1914, during the First World War, signals sent from its summit jammed German transmissions and helped direct French troops at the Battle of the Marne, a turning point that stopped the enemy advance on Paris. The lesson was clear. The tower was no longer just a monument. It was a weapon of communication. And when the Second World War arrived a generation later, the Eiffel Tower once again found itself drawn into the conflict. As German troops marched into Paris in 1940, the French cut the elevator cables, forcing Hitler and his entourage to climb the stairs if they wished to reach the top. The Nazis later repaired the system and used the tower's transmitters for their own purposes. But that small act of sabotage revealed just how vital the tower had become. And a few years later, in 1944, as the Allies and Free French retook the city, the antennas atop the Eiffel Tower relayed the messages of liberation. So there was never a single decree that made the tower permanent. The question of dismantling it simply faded away. First, its life was extended because of its strategic value in wartime. Then, in the 1920s and 30s, it became a national hub for radio and later television. Little by little, it went from being just an engineering marvel to a scientific tool to becoming part of Paris itself. Artists who once denounced it as a monstrosity began to see it differently. Painters, like Robert Delaunay, celebrated its form in bold colors and fractured cubist canvases. Writers and poets embraced it too. Guillaume Apollinaire, Blaise Cendrars, or Louis Aragon used the tower as a symbol of modernity, a synonym of Paris stretching toward the future. Cinema followed. From the earliest black and white reels to Hollywood epics, the Eiffel Tower became a shorthand for Paris itself. A glimpse of its iron silhouette, and the audience knew instantly where they were. And of course, tourists arrived in ever greater numbers, making the tower into one of the most visited monuments in the world. It also became a place of proposals, protests, light shows, and celebrations, a stage on which Paris performs itself. The tower had moved beyond its origins as an engineering gamble. It had become a kind of mirror, reflecting each generation's image of Paris: modern, romantic, resilient. More than a century after its completion, it's easy to forget that the Eiffel Tower was once meant to be dismantled, and even easier to forget how hated it once was. What began as a temporary gamble became the very symbol of a city and one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. This teaches us something important about architecture and about the built environment, which is that buildings are not frozen in the moment they're built. They are alive. The most powerful architecture becomes a canvas onto which we project our dreams, hopes, and fears, both collectively and individually. That's how a structure born out of engineering ambition can become a stage for culture, a backdrop for love stories, or even a weapon in war. The Eiffel Tower is all of these things at once and more. And maybe that's why, more than a century later, people still stand in its shadow and look up in silence. Because in the end, the Eiffel Tower does not only tell the story of Paris, it tells the story of us, of you and me. And this brings us to the end of today's episode. I know I have already asked you to follow Architecture Topics on your favorite platform, but now that the episode is over, what would really mean the world to me is if you could spare a minute and leave a review. Thank you for listening to Architecture Topics. I'm Liam Caron, and I'll see you next time. Until then, keep looking up.